Alright guys, I'm going to try to wrap up chapter 3 here. I'm sorry, chapter 1, part 3. So this is where we left off, if you remember. Interpersonal mass communication, and now we're switching gears a little bit. We want to take care of just kind of knock out a couple of definitions. It's important to understand the difference between synchronous media and asynchronous media. So synchronous media is just media that take place in real time. Okay, so live TV, live radio. The important thing here is that these kind of synchronous media productions require that the audience be present during the broadcast or performance or whatever it is. Asynchronous media are just the opposite of that. Media that do not require the audience to assemble at a given time. So, when you watch a rerun of a show on Netflix or whatever, that's an example of an asynchronous media. Few things to think about when we're talking about this blurred line between mass and interpersonal communication. Think about, I've already talked about this, but emails that you send to many people, there's kind of an example of an interpersonal communication that can spread into a mass communication if you're sending it to a lot of people. Think about blogs. Usually blogs are small, they require registration, they require commenters to leave their names, so it's not anonymous. So in this sense, it's not really mass communication. However, there are some people who have massively large blogs. Technically, Huffington Post, those articles that you read, those are technically blog posts. It's one of the biggest blogs in the world. So that's just an example. So now that's not really interpersonal communication anymore, is it? That's clearly mass communication. So again, an example where the lines have been blurred. And I talked a little bit about Twitter. You can have the direct interpersonal communication in Twitter. You can message people, tweet at them and stuff like that. But then it's really kind of a mass communication because everyone has access, right? You don't necessarily know the people. A person, particularly somebody who has a lot of followers on Twitter, could send a tweet out and it could be seen by, and you've seen this I'm sure, but thousands, in some cases hundreds of thousands, and in some cases millions of people could see a particular tweet. Chapter 1 also talks about the functions of mass communication, and traditionally these are divided into 4 functions: the surveillance, correlation, cultural transmission, and entertainment functions. And I'd like to look at these in turn. So if you look at the surveillance function, this is kind of the basic function of the news media. The job of the mass media, one job, one function for the mass media is to survey society and then tell us what's going on. That's basically the job of the news media, right? Entertainment media, not so much. That's a different. They have their own thing going on. But news media have this surveillance function, right? And it's through news media that mass media fulfill this surveillance function. Now, we have to ask ourselves, and ask yourself this question: do you think American news media do a good job of surveying the environment and then telling us what's going on? We could get into all kinds of debates. We're going to talk throughout really the course of this term, different points in time, about how American news media perform. As a news scholar, I would argue that American news products are severely lacking, that we suffer from several, we're plagued by several problems. One of them we've already talked about, the concentration of ownership. That's a major problem. So you have owners who influence content. That's a problem. Another problem is the profit-making function of the news. They have to make money, right? They're not doing this for free. Now, one of the problems with having to make money is you end up having to compete with other news outlets. And these other news outlets, how can I say this? During the course of competition with these other news outlets, you end up having to try to one-up them. And that leads, that constant effort to try to gain new audience members and beat your competition, that leads sometimes, unfortunately, to sensationalism. That's where we get the whole "if it bleeds, it leads" news culture. You've heard of that. You've heard of "if it bleeds, it leads." This is why, you turn on the news, right? You'd think the world is a really nasty place if all you watched is the news, because they're emphasizing the blood and the guts and the gore, because that's what a lot of people want to see. That's what gets ratings. I used to work in TV news, and um, it was hard sometimes for me, because there were times when it was just so clear we were sensationalizing, and that was difficult for me to swallow. But we'll talk more about that later. There are also issues with stereotyping. Lots of research into stereotypes in news media. And then there's the whole issue of how the news media deal with the government. They're supposed to be watchdogs, right? You've heard of that. The news media are watchdogs. Are they really, though? Well, some scholars say no. Many scholars say they're not really watchdogs. They end up kind of giving us the government line on a lot of things. They end up, this is why Sam Donaldson of ABC News said, we usually end up the day with whatever the White House has suggested for us as a story. Because nobody has more press machinery, public relations machinery, than the powerful, than the government, the elites. They call more press conferences. They release more statements. They can do more with the media in terms of their media relations than anyone else. And so news media cover them, and they inordinately give their perspective. So this is why Donahue, Titchener, and Olean propose what they call the guard dog model of the U.S. press. They say that the news media in the U.S., according to their research, it's not really acting as a watchdog. It's actually they're guarding the interests of the government. They're actually guard dogs for the government and for other elites. And Herman and Chomsky present what they call a propaganda model, and we'll talk more about that later in this term. Correlation. This is another important function for the media. The media's job, part of their job, is to interpret events and issues and and ascribe meanings to those events and issues, to kind of make sense of things for us. This is sort of related, closely related to the surveillance function, right? They help us make sense of the world. But again, one criticism here is that we end up getting dominant elites. We get their interpretation because they're the sources, but we don't get anything else. We get this narrowing of voices, again, with the concentration of ownership, with the emphasis on elites as sources, and that's a major problem. So they don't necessarily. So some scholars would argue they don't do a very good job, at least not right now. They're not doing a very good job making sense of things for us. And reminds me of something that we're going to talk about later in the term. I'm trying to remember which lecture it comes in, but the Hutchins Commission. There was this group that was commissioned in the 1940s, and they published a report in 1947. Their job was to do a little bit of research on how the news media in the United States was doing, and then give their diagnosis and give their recommendations. And what they said was that the news media were doing a really poor job. And one of the problems was sensationalism. Another problem was concentration of ownership, and another problem was this reliance on elite sources. They said the news media tend to have an over-reliance on elite sources. So we hear what the president thinks, and what the State Department thinks, and what the governor thinks, and what the corporations think, but we're not necessarily hearing what much of anybody else thinks, right? So these are some of the issues, again, with surveillance and with correlation. Cultural transmission. This is another important function of the news media. They educate the society about the dominant culture and also subcultures. And it's important to note, cultural notions change over time. American culture today is not exactly the same as it was in the 1940s or 1950s, right? What is the dominant American culture right now? How has it changed over time? Think about that. These are just things that you can think about in your own time. I mean, if we were in class, I'd ask you these questions and we would, we'd have a discussion. But just think about those things. One criticism, people that are thinking critically about this, they say that we end up kind of with a homogenous culture where it's not as diverse as it could be. Um, Media kind of teach us about sort of one mode, one way of doing things. Think about dress. Have you ever noticed how people in society end up dressing whatever way the media are portraying or suggesting at a given time, usually driven by elites, driven by celebrities. So that's why things go in and out of style. Usually it's not because some average Joe decided, you know what, I think I'm going to start I think I'll start wearing my hat backwards, my baseball cap. I think I'll start wearing it backwards. That probably starts with some celebrity, and it gets covered in the media. It gets portrayed in the media. So, arguably, we have a homogenous culture, and I mean, certainly there's some diversity, but a lot of sameness as well. And some folks have criticized the media for that. Another criticism is that one of the really dominant aspects of our culture at present is consumerism. This whole idea of born to buy. Whoever has the most toys at the end wins. Right? There was a book that was published called Born to Buy. We really do live in a consumer culture. I mean, if you just think about it, on your way to school or work or wherever, just think about how many advertisements you see. When you watch television, when you listen to the radio, when you're on the internet, we're constantly being programmed to go buy stuff. And in many cases, it's stuff that we don't even really need. And one of the things that I've noticed, and I think is deeply problematic, in my opinion, is how the way we advertise to children. I have two young children, right? So I have a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old, and they're sitting at home watching, Doc McStuffins, and the commercials come on, and it's just like, Daddy, 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 I gotta get, and they want all these toys that they see on television being advertised to them, and I find that to be a little bit ethically questionable because kids are really vulnerable, and they tend to think that if they don't get that there's some kind of a deficiency, like they need it, especially if one of their friends gets it, right? It's like, well, my friend has it, and why don't I have it? And the commercial's making it seems like it's really cool, and I'm trying to teach my kid, my youngest kid, about money. He doesn't get it yet. He's like, I'm trying to tell him, like, look, Daddy does not have an unlimited supply of money, and he's just like, what are you talking about? Just go, you got that little plastic thing, the little Visa. Give him the Visa, man, and get me the toy. And that's what he wants. But so consumer culture, that's something that American media have been criticized for as well. And then the last function, the last of the four, we might be able to think of other functions, but it's typically thought of as four functions. The entertainment function. Media entertain us. They give us music. They give us movies and books and so on and so forth. And this can be really good because art and culture can be promoted. But some critics, again, there's always critics, right? They suggest that media encourage, quote, lowbrow entertainment and not so much fine art. So some people criticize, they say, well, we're not exactly listening to Beethoven. You know what I mean? We're listening to, Justin Bieber or whoever, we're listening to, trying to think of an example of somebody who's very kind of lowbrow. That's just, a lot of the music nowadays, it's not really, I know, it's a good example, Kesha. It's not really saying a whole lot. Heard a couple of her songs, no disrespect to anybody who likes Kesha, you know what I mean? Might be like catchy beat or whatever, but it's like, not a whole lot going on there. And so people criticize. Same thing with a lot of the movies, right? It's a lot of the blood and the guts and the gore and make you laugh, but it's not high art in the way that arguably art used to kind of take center stage in that way in some of the pre-modern cultures. So instead of enhancing culture, media may just end up promoting triviality and escapism, right? And arguably harmful messages. One of the criticisms of hip-hop music, for instance. And I kind of grew up on hip-hop music, and I really like hip-hop music, but I have to be honest and objective. hip hop music some hip hop artists tend to really glorify consumerism, like money, buying things. Like you would think if you listen to some of these artists that that is the most important thing. Some of the songs glorify violence, they glorify criminal behavior. I always give the example of I used to listen to a lot of when I was growing up. I used to listen to a lot of Notorious B.I.G. Biggie Smalls, who's before your time, really. He died in 1997, the spring of '97. So a lot of you probably weren't even born, or you were no, you were born, but you were little babies or little toddlers at the time. But I mean, just to give you an example, he has a song called "The 10 Crack Commandments," and in this song, some of you've probably heard it, but he's basically giving crack dealers or prospective crack dealers, excuse me, kind of an instruction manual on how to sell crack very successfully and not get caught and also not get killed in the process. And that's kind of the point of the song. So he's not really just talking about, some hip hop artists say, well, I'm just talking about the realities of the inner city. Well, not really. You're kind of glorifying some of the more some of the harsher realities. And there's a difference. And there's, you look at movies, a lot of the times glorifying violence in the movies, glorifying criminal behavior. You ever seen the movie Ocean's 11, Ocean's 12, Ocean's 13? Those people are professional thieves, high-level thieves, and they're being glorified. Where you find yourself rooting for them, and at the end they get rewarded. They have the girls and the money, and they're off on the islands, and they win. Quentin Tarantino movies, there's a lot of these, and I'm not trying to hate on people, I mean, it's entertaining and whatever, and I like a good movie like the next guy, but we have to be honest and objective, and I think sometimes these entertainment forms arguably glorify things that, from an ethical perspective, maybe they shouldn't. Let's look at a couple of theories of communication. We're going to look at a lot of theories later in the term, but I do want to look at a couple of things right now. Shannon and Weaver, way back in 1948, presented a model of communication, the transmission model of communication. It was very simple. They wanted to kind of model how the communication process look, or what it looks like. And so they just had these 5 sites basically in their model. There was the source, the transmitter, noise, which is any interference that could happen, and then there's the receiver, and then there's the destination, right? So they basically, like for example on a telephone call, I'm the information source if I'm calling you. The transmitter is my phone. Noise might be a bad connection. The receiver is your phone, and then the destination is you. That's kind of a really simple model, but it kind of models the famous question that was asked by Harold Laswell when he asked, "Who says what, in which channel, to whom, and with what effect?" That's kind of the famous mass communication effects question. If you read an effects book, you'll see that question being asked. But it's a really simple model. It's one directional, doesn't allow for feedback. And then later, Schramm and Osgood developed in 1954 a circular model of communication, which allowed for feedback. So it's a little bit different from the Shannon and Weaver model. I want to talk a little bit about critical theory. Even the Schramm and Osgood model does not account for different ways in which people interpret messages. Not everyone interprets a message the same way. Critical theorists came along and they said, not only do we not like these simplistic models, we just don't like the way mass communication researchers are thinking about the effects of the mass media, because it's complicated, it's complex. Critical theorists were saying, and we'll talk about this more later, but a lot of these scholars, a lot of the mass communication researchers, what they were doing, and what a lot of them continue to do, is they do these one-shot effects studies. So for example, Let's say I wanted to examine the effects of violent movies on people. Do violent movies make people more violent? Well, here's what people would do. Here's what researchers do. They sit people down in a room, they ask them a bunch of questions, and then they show them a movie, a violent movie, and then they ask them some more questions at the end of the movie. And they try to see if something happened before and after, right? A lot of times they find no effect. And they're like, okay, mass communication does not affect people. So critical theorists are like, I don't like that. Critical theorists are saying that is not a good way. These one-shot experiments, not a good way to measure effects. Because critical theorists are saying, you know what? Effects might happen over time after prolonged exposure. And you know what? They might not show up on a simple little questionnaire when you ask people. It's probably more complicated than that. And so that's why they're called critical theorists. They're critical of the way things are being done, and they're critical of many other things in society. Okay? So we'll talk more about critical theory later. Cultural studies is similar in some ways to critical theory, but cultural studies scholars are interested in trying to uncover the complexity of the mass media world. They look at symbols and codes that are embedded within messages. They try to think about patterns of representation. What is the deep meaning of this message? What's the deep meaning of this new advertising campaign? This new McDonald's commercial or whatever? What's the ideology? What are the power relations? These are the kinds of questions that they're trying to answer. I was going to try to get this done in part 3. I'm going to have to go on to part 4 because my wife and kids are coming home. They've just arrived, and they're going to make my kids are going to make a lot of noise. So to be continued. We just have 2 slides left in chapter 1, guys. So it'll be to continued, and it'll end here momentarily.